Are there specific factors that need to be considered in order to build a runway? Are runways built randomly? If they're not, why are they pointing in totally different directions all over the world, as well as the amount of runways are random? Yo, what's up? My name is Manuel, and I'm really, really glad you're here. If aviation is your passion, just like me, I would highly encourage you to subscribe because aviation is the topic of the entire channel. I promise you that. And so, yeah, today's topic is going to be about that. And without any further ado, let's get into it. So let's analyze the actual complexity because the building an airport is a lot more complex. Like it is way more complex than you might actually think right now because there are so many factors that need to be considered in order to build an airport. And in order to put into perspective, let's look at Google Earth. Let's if we actually zoom in at a random, at a random city such as, LA or San Francisco, anywhere, the first thing you see when you zoom in at a random city is the airport. You always see the airport, and not just the airport, you see the runways. The runways are the biggest things in the airport, and and this is probably one of the first things that need to be considered. It is a thing that requires the most space, and and yes, they are really, really important. And yes, of course, it is where airplanes take off and land. And let's look at some of the factors when you need to consider when it comes to runways, answering the question of the title, which in short words, they're not built randomly. I mean, yeah, there are so many factors that need to be considered, and one of them is ground terrain. And when I mean ground terrain, it is the space availability. I should have, yeah, space availability. That is when it comes to ground terrain. And because you can't just build an airport in any part of the city or town, you have to consider the because you have to consider that airports need a lot of space, especially if you're building a big airport. And and yes, and when you say a lot of space, it means that you have to buy it. You have to buy someone else's property in order to take it and replace it to an airport, which is one of the reasons it is expensive. And also, you have to agree with every institute that the airport is going to be built with many issues such as traffic, noise, etc. And also, you have to have the free terrain around for potential expansion and safety. If there's an accident in an aircraft, you don't want it to affect the third party damage as little as possible. You want it to affect as little as possible, as well as you might want to build it a little bigger if it's actually really popular. Another really important factor is mountain terrain. Mountain terrain is basically the terrain clearance. The terrain, when I mean the mountains, hills, etc. It is really important because you have to make sure that basically that the runways are not pointing to any terrain possible. And if they're not, if one of the runways is actually pointing to a terrain, i.e. Madeira, Lukla, etc., you have to modify the approaches and or departures. The approach to Madeira and runway 05 is a really good example. They basically make this very quick turn before landing, when it comes to the runway, when it comes to the landing, it's the only reason they do that is because of the terrain. They do that to evade the terrain and make it as safe as possible. And if it's actually not possible to make any variations with the approach or anything like that, we have to consider other areas farther away from the terrain and make it as safe as possible. Remember, safety is the top priority in aviation. Now, the third thing is the fact that every aircraft needs to take off or land in a headwind. A headwind, I mean that the wind is coming from directly towards the aircraft, directly against the direction the aircraft is going, and with that it increases lift and slows down ground speed, which means that it is really efficient when it comes to going to the ground or taking off from the ground. And with that in mind, you need to build the runways pointing in where the wind normally hits in the area, and which is in order to increase the possibilities of a direct headwind that is really efficient. You don't want a direct crosswind because it is a little more risky, and you also actually want a tailwind because if there's a tailwind, you just use the opposing runway, which is pretty simple. And how do you know that? Well, a very simple example is with coastal airports, which the fact is 90% of the time the runways point to the ocean because it's where the wind most of the time comes from. That is why you see LA. That is why you see there are many examples. Also Puerto Vallarta and Cancun, and there are many other areas. And yes, it is because the wind normally hits in towards the runway. Now, this is so self-explanatory, and it is a fact that population really affects. I mean, self-explanatory, because the bigger the city or town, the bigger you want the airport to be. You want, and yeah, that includes the size of the terminals and size of the runways. The size of the runways is a factor, and this affects the other factor I'm gonna talk about, which is aircraft types. The aircraft types, which means that if the area is very populous, then you have to consider bigger aircraft, which means longer runways. The bigger the aircraft, they need the bigger the lift, and that means the longer the runways. If it's not possible, design the airport in a way that only fits only fits the aircraft types that are necessary. If it only occupies mid-haul aircraft, make it in such a way that it only occupies mid-haul aircraft. And of course, if population is big, just try to find other ways to increase the size of the runways in order to fit long-haul aircraft. And an example is that if it's for general aviation only, don't make it as long as as an international airport runway, because those things are really big, and and yes, they're monstrous for the only purpose to fit, such as Boeing 747. So those are commercial airliners, and they are mostly for international runways. In fact, for general aviation airports or aerodromes, you don't even have to make it with asphalt or concrete. You can just make it of uh you can just make it with grass or granite or anything. I mean, even water. General aviation aircraft are some of them are designed to land in water, and yes, it is something that needs to be considered. Now, this is pretty simple, and it is basically elevation. Basically, if you're at sea level, well, you're basically fine. You're basically fine with the planned runway length in order to fit the aircraft types. But if you're actually really high at sea level, an example is Mexico City. It's at 7,300 feet above sea level. Then you have to make the runways longer because the higher you are, the lower the air pressure and the lower the lift, and that is why you need more runway. And now let's address the bear in the room. This is the most important factor when it comes to building an airport. That is legal authorization, because you have to give permission to your government or institute if you have an idea for an airport, especially if you're near an international airport or even just a regional airport, because that affects transportation, and that affects the entire country, which affects the government. The government, that is why it has the control to tell you to make an airport or not. and and especially if you're planning to be near an airport, you have to consider traffic flow, which means modifying departures in such a way that there's no risk of mid-air collision or anything, as well as arrivals, approaches, and especially safety. Safety is the number one thing that needs to be considered, and it is considered with all the factors we mentioned: wind, terrain, mountains, etc. And all those things are connected to safety. That is the topic of this video. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, I highly encourage you to subscribe because aviation is the only topic of this channel, and you won't miss, if you subscribe, you won't miss any video that you might actually find really good, or even a fact that you didn't even know at any time, which is why I highly encourage you to subscribe. And with all that said and done, I will see you on the next video. Happy flying.